Hours after the historic arrest of the former president, Donald Trump was back on the campaign trail, reportedly raising millions of dollars in this one event. How will another court case affect the 45th president when it comes to both the politics and the prosecution? Our legal experts explain the process and the considerations given to even filing charges. A new leadership team appears in Jacksonville with a bipartisan group named by the incoming mayor. One of the city's newly elected officers joins us, Joyce Morgan, on her new role and what she expects from City Council on This Week in Jacksonville. Glad you joined us today. History made this week, and American politics may never be the same. Former President Donald Trump facing 37 federal charges and pleaded not guilty in Miami this week. News4Jax political analyst Rick Mullaney is with us. We also welcome Curtis Fallgatter, who's a local defense attorney and former federal prosecutor. Rick, Curtis, what a stunning thing. Both of you have decades of experience as attorneys. What's your reaction, Curtis, if you begin, to seeing Donald Trump charged?
Well, it's unprecedented. 250 years of our country and no president or former president has ever been charged. So these are very serious charges. So a lot of folks thought it was coming. Special counsel, of course, investigated it for months. And as you know, this is not the only case out there, and others might be coming.
Yeah, Rick, what was your view as we watched that unfold this week?
Well, I certainly agree it's unprecedented. As Curtis just said, it's the first time in history, nearly 250 years since the founding of our country, that you've seen a former president indicted on federal charges. But it's even more significant than that. He was indicted as the leading candidate for president in the Republican Party, and he was indicted by a Justice Department in which the Attorney General was appointed by his opponent, and that's Joe Biden. That adds to the mix of his argument, his political argument, and has led some, such as the Wall Street Journal, to suggest that despite the gravity of the charges, it's a really serious matter to indict under these circumstances and sets a precedent that we'll live with for years to come.
I want to talk about what stands out in the indictment, 49 pages. But first, I want to show these images here. Stunning to see these sketches, the images of one of the most famous people on the planet in court as a defendant and in a case that is grabbing international attention. So, Rick, does the arraignment and arrest hurt American interests across the world?
Boy, really hard to say, Kent. There is no question it's gotten domestic attention, but it's also gotten global attention. Certainly here, politically, Donald Trump has been very defiant and very aggressive and is using it politically to his advantage for fundraising, and in the primary, it could hurt him in the general. But globally, I suspect they're finding this a little bit hard to understand, and so hard to assess the impact internationally, but certainly domestically. We are preoccupied and focused on something that we've never seen before.
Yeah. Curtis, what stands out to you in terms of that 49-page indictment, these 37 charges? We've read through it. What stood out to you?
Well, of course, it's a reprehensible conduct. Other folks have been investigated for having national security information, but the conduct here, obstruction of justice, getting lawyers to ask them to lie, ask them to shred documents to get rid of them, moving the documents around, lying to the Department of Justice, lying to the grand jury. That's the type of conduct. Yeah, folks can call it political, but this is bedrock criminal law 101. So that conduct, and of course it's all spelled out in what we call a speaking indictment, which means the prosecutor has laid out the proof, photographs, quotes of interviews, quotes of recordings that Mr. Trump made, his own words being used against him. So it's a very powerful indictment. His own former Attorney General, Mr. Barr, said basically he's toast. You read this as a prosecutor, and you look at it and say, that's a powerful case, he should be convicted.
So you prosecuted cases on that federal level. I know early in your career, you were a prosecutor here in Northeast Florida. And tell me what goes into this, because as you were explaining to me this week, the role really is to seek justice, not necessarily there may have been a crime, you must file charges. How does this work? Rick, I'll begin with you.
Well, Ken, I was a prosecutor for 10 years at the state court level, not at the federal level. But I think there's an impression that for prosecutors, their role is simply to seek convictions, to send people to jail, and to always file criminal charges. But it's a much bigger responsibility than that. The duty is to do justice, and that requires the exercise of discretion. Here, I agree with Curtis that this 49-page indictment is very detailed, and these are the allegations from the prosecution side, but it's very, very compelling. But for any prosecutor, there's kind of a first step is, are they guilty? And do you have the proof? But then that last step is the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. Do you charge? For example, it wasn't a prosecutor, it was Mr. Comey, when he was the director of the FBI, saying no reasonable prosecutor would have indicted Hillary Clinton Was he referring to probable cause for crimes being committed? Was he referring to the exercise of prosecutorial discretion? As I mentioned before, I think the Wall Street Journal, very interestingly, and Mike Pence have come to the conclusion, or at least argue, that on that issue of prosecutorial discretion, it's not being about the rule of law and somebody's above the law. It's not done for favoritism or because someone's wealthy or powerful. It's a question of what's in the best interest of the nation. And that's where some people have a disagreement in this case.
Yeah, Curtis, I remember, so 6 years ago, several years ago, former Congresswoman Corrine Brown running for re-election. So she's a candidate at the time. She's facing federal prosecution. And you and I spoke about this. There is a certain level that the Department of Justice goes to. They usually get convictions. You've got to be really buttoned up to bring charges like this. Is that right?
The federal folks have months and tons of resources, very talented agents, FBI and otherwise, to investigate. So by the time they get to the case, they have a strong case. And they don't just look at probable cause to charge. They have to look down the road. And we had an adage, if you're going to take on the king, you better take out the king. So when you're taking on a public official or, in this case, the former president, you have to have a very powerful case, and you have to feel like it's the right thing to do. Obviously, that's the role of the special counsel, and most folks that look at the facts of the case look at it and say, this is not something we can ignore. Look at the national security interests that were implicated. Tens of thousands of people went through Mar-a-Lago. Lives were at jeopardy with those confidential documents being out and about. He shared them with other people. So the national security interests are at the heart of this indictment.
Is it difficult for a prosecutor or the Department of Justice in this case to have to weather some kind of storm? Because what we've seen is the former president's defense is to attack the Department of Justice and to attack and say this is all politically motivated. It's not about evidence.
When you're a prosecutor, you have to have a thick skin, because there'll be some defendants and their lawyers who will call you names, will call it a corrupt prosecution. So they just have to take that. None of that gets in front of a jury. The jury's going to look at the facts of the case. So if I'm a prosecutor, call me all the names you want, but let's see you in court and let's figure out the evidence. Let the jury make a fair decision.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Rick?
I agree with Curtis. There's a legal issue and legal analysis, and then there's a political analysis. And the things that Donald Trump is doing in terms of the politics is not a legal defense. And in fact, I do agree with Curtis. These are very compelling allegations. It's very detailed. You look at that complaint, very, very serious for Donald Trump.
So serious charges and serious those political ramifications. We're going to talk more about that, but stay with us. Still more to discuss, and we'll continue that conversation with Rick Mullaney and Curtis Fallgatter when we continue on This Week in Jacksonville. Don't go anywhere.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And thank you for joining us and staying with us this morning. Attorney General Merrick Garland leads the Justice Department. He said he would not answer questions about the particulars of the case against President Trump, but he defended the special counsel, Jack Smith.
As I said when I appointed Mr. Smith, I did so because it underscores the Justice Department's commitment to both independence and accountability. Mr. Smith is a veteran career prosecutor. He has assembled a group of experienced and talented prosecutors and agents who share his commitment to integrity and the rule of law.
So here at our roundtable, Curtis Fallgatter, a local defense attorney, former federal prosecutor, also News4Jack's political analyst, Rick Mullaney. So, Curtis, what goes into the decisions a prosecutor would make are concerning whether or not they should file charges? And again, we've looked at this 49-page indictment here.
Sure. Well, first and foremost is, what is the evidence? Does it establish the crimes that are charged? If so, what are the crimes? Which ones are fairly charged? Here, of course, important distinction, the records that were returned are not part of this indictment. It's only those that he withheld, concealed, lied about are part of the indictment, and of course the obstruction that follow that. So that's what the prosecutors look at. Can they prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? And with a notorious figure such as Mr. Trump, you want to take it to a level above that, proof above and beyond a reasonable doubt, because you want to make sure your case is strong enough to have a successful result.
Rick, as we talked about last segment, you spent your early years prosecuting cases. What's your view on this, and does it rise to that level of, yes, this must be prosecuted, even though we've got these other circumstances, including the person who's the defendant is running for president?
You know, Kent, you can't deny how awkward this is for the country. And Merrick Garland struggled with this. Back when Donald Trump announced he was running for president again, that's when he appointed Jack Smith the special counsel, because he recognized that in terms of public credibility, he needed to try to put a little bit of distance between himself, because he's appointed by Joe Biden, and he recognizes that with Donald Trump running again, that this could be, as it is, unprecedented and historic. As it's turned out since that time with Jack Smith, Donald Trump has widened his lead. That happened after the indictment in New York. He's increased his fundraising. So you had the circumstance in which, an uncircumstance that nobody wants in the nearly 250 years of our country since its founding, of that circumstance of indicting not just a former president on federal charges, but someone who's the leading candidate for president and being indicted by a Justice Department appointed by the president, as I mentioned earlier. But what goes into it for the prosecution side is exactly what Curtis talked about. What are the facts? Is he guilty? As a state prosecutor at Austin taught us, we had to have a reasonable probability of conviction, not just probable cause. But I agree with Curtis. In these circumstances, you had better have an airtight case and know that you can prove it. Once you do that, you have to exercise that judgment as to whether or not, under these circumstances, you're going to go forward, knowing it's going to be so consequential, so historic, and so unprecedented.
Curtis, I'd like your input on this. How does this compare to the case that President Trump is facing now, with the holding on to documents that may have been classified by the current president when he was vice president and the former vice president, Mike Pence?
Huge, huge difference. In those cases, those folks cooperated. They produced the records. There's no evidence of any intent to conceal. They didn't conceal. They didn't ask their lawyers to lie. They didn't ask the lawyers to get rid of documents. They didn't have an aide run around and hide boxes. That aide moved boxes all over the place, including on the airplane. One time he moved like 64 boxes up to Trump's residence, hiding them from his own lawyers. So that is an intent issue that doesn't exist in those other cases, and that's what makes it criminal.
4 criminal investigations now into Donald Trump. Rick, are they all the same in terms of the significance of the charges that he's facing?
They are not. There's 4 investigations. The first, and he's already been indicted on it, is a state court, state crimes, alleged state crimes, in a 34-count indictment out of New York. That prosecution in particular has been widely criticized in terms of how old the charges are, the factual underpinnings, some legal allegations, and it relates to business records and the payment to cover up an affair from years ago. The second one, however, is this one, and it shouldn't be. This indictment should not be confused with the New York indictment. This, as Curtis has pointed out, is detailed, it's compelling, it's federal charges on classified documents. There's a third one out of Georgia, which I anticipate he will be indicted. That's been made fairly clear by the prosecutor out of Fulton County in Georgia. I expect that to happen sometime between July 1st and September 30th. That indictment is coming. And then the fourth investigation, which I think is the most serious subject matter, and that is January 6th and the riot, and what role did Donald Trump play, if any, and what kind of charges might be brought by the federal government relating to what happened on January 6th. Those are the 4 investigations.
And Curtis, it sounds like, because of the process, and you want to have due process, you want to be fair to all parties involved, but it sounds like these won't necessarily be resolved before there's an election to name the next president.
They won't be resolved probably in terms of trials, but there's a good chance that the indictments will be returned. And really all 4 have the common thread. You know, the New York case, sure, it involves business campaign, but it goes to the underlying issue of how he got elected as president by lying about, you know, paying a payoff to a porn star. So all of those have some impact on democracy. I agree with Rick. The last one truly is the most important. When there's an insurrection, an attack on the Capitol, asking the vice president not certify, contacting state legislatures, asking them to send in fake electors, phone calls, you know, to the Secretary of State in Georgia, all that so much undermines democracy. 1,000 people have been prosecuted on that insurrection case, all of which they did because of our president. So that truly is, in my opinion, in terms of our democracy, the most important of all of them.
So we're going to run out of time for this segment. I got good news for you. Stand by. Rick, let me have you wrap this up. The former president says the charges against him destroy democracy, that they aren't fair and that they tear down what is so important to our republic.
He's going to make that political argument, and we should be clear. The charges don't prevent him from running. Conviction doesn't prevent him from running. Even a jail sentence doesn't prevent him from running. Donald Trump has made it clear that he's all in. And as it stands today, he's the leading candidate to get the nomination on the Republican side. And the way he's framing this, it may actually help him. That is not true necessarily for the general election. When it comes to those independent voters, moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats, these 4 investigations, these 4 potential indictments could weigh very, very heavily.
There is so much to talk about. And so here's that good news that I was telling you about. We want to offer you more perspective from both of these gentlemen, Curtis Fallgatter and Rick Mullaney, and you're going to find it on News4Jax Plus. You search News4Jax on your streaming device. You can download our app there. And then once you're there, you're going to find this interview under the This Week in Jacksonville channel. Thank you so much, men.
Yes, sir.
New leadership coming in Duval County. Joyce Morgan, she's making the transition from city council to constitutional officer. She's going to join us next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Joyce Morgan has a well-known and long public career, and that includes time here at Channel 4 as an anchor and reporter, and more recently, the Honorable Joyce Morgan, wrapping up her second term in Jacksonville in City Council. So welcome back to the studio, and soon, Duval County welcoming you as the property appraiser. How excited are you about the changes that are on the way?
I'm very excited, Kent. Thank you for having me today. You know, looking at more than 100,000 Duval County residents voting for me to be their next property appraiser is quite overwhelming. It's humbling, and I accept that. And I accept that challenge, and I am ready to get to work for the citizens of Jacksonville, just like I did in District 1.
So tell me about those 8 years city council. How do you feel about your time as one of those 19 council members, and maybe what will you miss most about that post?
Well, I can tell you what I will miss the most. I will miss my 80 town hall meetings that I did as a District 1 council member. I came in September of 2015, and from that time on, I was doing town hall meetings for my constituents every month, and that is what I'm going to miss. I'm going to miss touching them, feeling them, hearing their concerns in a very personal way. That's what I'm going to miss the most. I went to the grand opening of our new Wawa in Arlington at the corner of University Boulevard and Arlington Road. And what I found as a council member is there are so many projects on the books, and they take so long to come to fruition. That's the sad part. There are so many projects out there that we've started that I will not be the council member when they come up. But you know what? I'll still be there.
Yeah. Let me shift gears just a little bit here. This is part of the change that we're talking about, but Mayor-elect Donna Deegan announced her staff this week. What do you think about, when you see this photo, what do you think about the appointments, the people who are represented here are going to be in that administrative staff?
It looks like the city of Jacksonville, and that's how I look at that, and I'm so excited to see so many women and just so many people that a lot of us feel have been left out of this city for so long. It looks great.
One of the things the mayor-elect said was, hey, we're going to try and, hey, I've always been across party lines if you look at it that way. So that picture shows some of that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It really does. And I think even for my time as a city council member, I had so many partnerships. Those partnerships were with everyone in the community. And that's who we are. That's who we're supposed to be as elected officials if we do our job the right way. The right way.
So clearly you're going to be in a separate office. You won't
Yes.
necessarily work in City Hall, but is there any sort of alignment that will happen here that is necessary for property appraiser for the Duval County residents and the mayor's office or city council?
Well, there is a relationship. Just like everyone else submits a budget, the budget for the property appraiser's office is just a little different. It goes to the Department of Revenue. And so typically, the way it's been set up in years past, at least the past 8 years with Jerry Holland, the property appraiser will go to the mayor's review committee and just have them look at the budget to be sure that it's all in line with what the mayor's budget is in line with. And then it goes to the Department of Revenue. It comes back from the Department of Revenue, and then it goes through the City Council. And basically, for the past 8 years, the City Council has pretty much okayed it as it is.
Do you anticipate that being the same for what you're trying to do?
I do anticipate that being the same because it's already gone through the Department of Revenue. I believe if it clears the Department of Revenue, it should clear our city council.
Tell me a little bit about this. I know as a council member there for these last 8 years, where you get to weigh in on all the things happening in the city of Jacksonville. So tell me, I know you're moving out of council, but what are your thoughts about the Jaguars stadium renovation proposal? And maybe that would affect what you're doing in the future here. Would it, whether there's a tax increase or how this is going to be funded if there's an agreement? It's a big deal for the city.
It is a big deal, and so much of the city budget comes from the property appraiser assessing the taxable values of the commercial real estate for the residential real estate, and that's how we know how much money we have, and we've seen that we have quite a substantial amount of money right now that is going to be going into the city coffers come October the 1st. And so just looking at that, of course, everything that happens will certainly impact it, but how much will impact, we simply don't know. And I think I'm just going to wait until we see what the mayor has coming up and how she's going to set these negotiations up and how she's going to go through that. In other words, I don't think I should be jumping the gun on one way or another. Just, we'll let it play out. Yes.
Well, maybe we wrap up here. Donna Deegan and Joyce Morgan and new city councilman Ken Amaro all share something in common.
Yes, we do.
Is there a bond among former TV news personalities? And maybe what's your advice to the new city council member?
Well, I have spent a lot of time with Ken just getting ready, and he's come to my town hall meetings. He came to the opening for Wawa. So whatever is going on in the district, I try to include him in, and I will continue that until the 30th of June, and that will be my last day, and he will take over July 1st. But just always patience, patience.
I hope you'll have patience with me. We're out of time. I appreciate getting to talk with you and appreciate you being with us. Be with us next week, Jacksonville City Council President Terrence Freeman, getting ready to hand over the title. He'll join us next time. Have a good day.
See why every day more people are choosing News 4 Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.